The humid air of Montañita clung to everything that evening, heavy with the scent of salt and seaweed drifting in from the Pacific. The small beach town was alive with music and laughter, filled with tourists and backpackers from all over the world. But for two young women from Argentina, Montañita would become the final stop on a trip that was supposed to be filled with adventure, freedom, and memories. Maria José Coni, just 22, was spirited and fearless, with a deep love for travel. She had saved every peso she could for months, dreaming of visiting Ecuador with her best friend. Marina Menegazzo, 21, was quieter, gentler in nature, but equally determined to experience life beyond the borders of Mendoza, their hometown. Together, they had been inseparable, sharing whispered dreams of exotic beaches and the open road. Their journey across South America had gone smoothly until those last few days in Montañita. Money was running out, and both girls began discussing ways to stretch their trip a little longer. On February 22nd, 2016, they realized they had no place to stay for the night. The hostels were either full or beyond what they could afford. That was when they met them, two men offering help, smiles that seemed friendly, a promise of a safe place to sleep. The details of what happened next remain unclear, but witnesses recalled seeing the girls walking away with those men. Montañita's vibrant streets swallowed them up, the neon lights fading behind as they were led into the shadows. Neither Maria José nor Marina knew that this simple decision, born from trust and necessity, would lead them straight into a nightmare they could never escape. For 2 days, no one realized they were gone. Friends back in Argentina expected messages, photos, or updates. Silence replaced their usual chatter. Then, on February 26th, the horror surfaced. A local found a body wrapped in black plastic bags along a dirt path not far from Montañita's edge. Within hours, another body appeared under eerily similar circumstances. Both had been discarded like trash, hidden away in the suffocating heat of the Ecuadorian coast. The news spread fast. 2 young women, far from home, brutally murdered in a place that promised paradise. The discovery sent shockwaves, not just through Ecuador, but across Argentina and the entire world. Parents clutched their children tighter. Travelers whispered warnings about the dangers of trusting strangers. And beneath it all, an unsettling question lingered: who could do something so monstrous, and why? As investigators began piecing together the events of those missing days, a story of betrayal, violence, and unimaginable cruelty began to unravel. Maria, José, and Marina's final journey was no longer about adventure, it was about survival, though neither would live to tell the tale. The sun dipped below the horizon in Montañita that evening, casting long shadows across the beach. The waves rolled in as if nothing had happened, but somewhere inland, 2 lives had been stolen, and the darkness that hid their killers was only beginning to surface. The discovery of the bodies sent Montañita spiraling into chaos. Tourists who had once strolled freely along the beaches now clutched their belongings tightly, their carefree smiles replaced by nervous glances over their shoulders. Local police cordoned off the area where the black bags had been dumped, though the smell of death lingered long after the bodies were removed. The once vibrant town was now haunted by whispers of murder. The girls' families in Argentina were devastated when the news reached them. Maria José's parents could barely comprehend the words "found dead," "Ecuador," "foul play suspected." Marina's family, stunned and broken, asked how such horror could happen in a place that had seemed so safe. Their grief soon turned to anger. as they demanded justice from authorities thousands of miles away. Back in Montañita, investigators scrambled. The Ecuadorian police had little experience handling cases that would draw international attention. The pressure was immediate, with Argentine officials and international media demanding answers. Within hours, suspicion turned to the men last seen with the victims. Witnesses described them clearly, enough locals who had offered the women help when they needed shelter. The first suspect, Aurelio Rodriguez, was a laborer known around town. The second, Juan Carlos Poveda, was his drinking companion, a man with a reputation for aggression when drunk. According to their own statements, they had invited the girls to stay at Aurelio's home since the hostels were full. But their version of events quickly unraveled. They claimed the women left after an argument. No one believed them. Investigators pieced together what they could. It was suspected that once inside the house, the men tried to take advantage of Maria, Jose, and Marina. When the girls resisted, violence erupted. What followed was unspeakably hours of torment before their lives were brutally taken. The killers then wrapped the bodies in plastic and discarded them along the road, believing the crime would vanish into Montañita's shadows. But Montañita was no longer just a sleepy coastal town. The case had become international, and the world demanded justice. Journalists swarmed the streets, digging into the suspects' pasts. Protesters in Argentina held vigils for the murdered girls, their candles burning bright against the darkness of grief. Social media exploded, with thousands demanding punishment for those responsible. Yet, as the investigation deepened, troubling questions arose. Were these two men truly the only ones involved? Or were they merely convenient scapegoats offered up quickly to calm the international outrage? Some locals whispered that there were others powerful men who had crossed paths with Maria, Jose, and Marina. Rumors swirled of connections that went far beyond Montañita, hinting at a larger, more sinister network. For the families of the victims, none of that mattered. They wanted answers. They wanted justice, and above all, they wanted the truth. But as the case gained momentum, the truth became harder to grasp, tangled in lies, fear, and silence. The waves continued to crash on Montañita's beaches, masking the screams that would never be heard again. Behind closed doors, the killers were the two or more believed they had buried their crimes under the weight of fear. But the world was watching, and the shadows of Montañita would not stay silent for long. Asterisk, asterisk. The arrests of Aurelio Rodriguez and Juan Carlos Poveda sent a ripple through Montañita. Tourists whispered their names in cafes, locals shook their heads in anger, and the families of Maria, Jose, and Marina clung to the fragile hope that justice was on the horizon. But the deeper the case went, the murkier the truth became. When the suspects were first brought into custody, the world expected confessions, evidence, and justice served swiftly. Instead, confusion unfolded. Aurelio claimed innocence, insisting that he had only offered the girls a place to stay out of kindness. Juan Carlos told a similar story, though inconsistencies in his statements betrayed unease. Their words shifted with every interrogation, yet both clung to the belief that someone else might have been involved. The trial, when it finally began, drew massive attention. International reporters filled the courtroom, their cameras flashing, capturing every grim detail. The judges sat stiffly, their expressions unreadable. As the prosecution laid out a horrifying narrative, the women were tricked, trapped, and brutally murdered. Photographs of the crime scene were shown, eliciting gasps from the audience. Maria, Jose, and Marina's families wept silently, clutching each other as they saw images they could never unsee. The defense painted a different picture. They suggested that the girls had been victims of robbery gone wrong, or even hinted that other men, not the accused, had orchestrated the crime. Rumors of drug trafficking and corruption slipped into the conversations, fueling doubts that justice would ever be straightforward. The defense's words planted seeds of suspicion that began to spread far beyond the courtroom. Outside, the streets pulsed with protests. Candlelight vigils in Argentina became larger, angrier. Protesters held signs reading "Not one less," a rallying cry against femicide across Latin America. The case of Maria, Jose, and Marina had become more than just one tragedy. It had become a symbol of how women's lives were repeatedly silenced, discarded, forgotten. Their story was now the story of thousands. As the trial dragged on, strange incidents stirred further unease. Witnesses recanted their statements. Evidence seemed to vanish. Investigators who once spoke with confidence now grew silent. Was this mere incompetence, or was something darker at work, an invisible hand guiding the case toward an outcome designed not for truth, but for convenience? In the end, both Aurelio and Juan Carlos were sentenced guilty. The families wept again, not from relief, but from exhaustion. It should have been justice. It should have been closure. Yet deep down, the grief-stricken families felt something was wrong. Too many questions were left unanswered. Too many whispers about powerful men, hidden deals, and silenced voices. The verdict closed the case in the eyes of the state, but for many, it only deepened the mystery. Was justice truly served, or had the real killers slipped back into the shadows of Montañita, watching as two desperate men took the fall? In Argentina, Maria Jose's and Marina's names were etched into memory, not only as victims, but as symbols of resistance. Their story fueled marches, voices shouting into the night, demanding a world where women were not disposable. But in Montañita, the air still felt heavy. The beach was beautiful, the waves still rolled endlessly, but something darker lingered, as though the sand itself remembered. And as night fell, locals still locked their doors early, whispering about what really happened that February night, knowing the truth was still buried somewhere in the shadows. The verdict was supposed to bring peace. Instead, it opened a wound that refused to heal. For Maria, Jose, and Marina's families, the guilty sentences were like a fragile bandage placed over a wound that was still bleeding. Deep inside, they felt the gnawing certainty that the real story was not what the court had presented. Back in Ecuador, locals spoke in hushed tones. Montañita's streets, once alive with surfboards, music, and laughter, now carried an eerie silence when the sun dipped below the horizon. Shopkeepers whispered that Aurelio and Juan Carlos were merely pawnsmen from poor, broken backgrounds. Easy to blame, easy to discard. But who was being protected? Who had the power to erase evidence, silence witnesses, and close the case so swiftly? Rumors began to grow legs. Some claimed that the girls had crossed paths with dangerous men involved in drug trafficking. Others whispered about a foreigner, a wealthy tourist with influence and connections, who might have been with them that night. Names floated in the air, but never made it into police reports. Every lead that could have pointed beyond the two accused seemed to vanish into smoke. In Argentina, Marina's sister became one of the loudest voices for truth. She traveled, spoke to reporters, and attended marches, refusing to let her sister's story be buried. "They killed them once," she said, But by silencing the truth, they're killing them again. Her words struck a chord, echoed across television screens, and lit a fire in thousands who already felt abandoned by systems that never protected women. Meanwhile, strange patterns emerged in Montañita. Residents recalled that days after the bodies were found, men in unmarked cars prowled the outskirts of town, asking questions but never identifying themselves. Investigators who tried to dig deeper were reassigned or went quiet. Some said they were threatened, others claimed they were encouraged to leave the case alone. The shadows around the investigation grew thicker, almost suffocating. Even Aurelio and Juan Carlos, behind bars, whispered about other men figures they couldn't name but described as powerful and untouchable. In moments of despair, they told fellow inmates that they had been framed. Whether it was the truth or a desperate attempt to shift blame, no one could say for sure. But one fact remained: the timeline never fully made sense. How did two young women, cautious and aware, end up trapped in such a brutal fate so quickly? Why did the police act with such speed in closing the case when countless questions were still unanswered? Maria, Jose, and Marina's story was no longer confined to Ecuador or Argentina. It had become international. Across Latin America, women filled the streets with chants of Ni una menos, not one less. Their faces painted with fury and grief, they marched not just for Maria, Jose, and Marina, but for every woman whose story ended in silence. Yet, the mystery still pulsed underneath the activism. In the town where the tragedy began, locals still lowered their voices at night, unwilling to speak openly about what they believed. Montañita had become more than a tourist paradise. It was now a town that carried secrets. Secrets that perhaps would never be spoken aloud. And somewhere, in the darkness of those whispered rumors, lay the truth of what really happened on that February night. A truth so twisted and dangerous, it remained buried, guarded by those who knew revealing it would cost them everything. Years passed, yet the case of Maria José Coni and Marina Menegazzo refused to rest. Their names lingered in the air like unfinished prayers, whispered in protests, etched on placards, and painted across walls in graffiti. But for their families, the pain was not just in memory, was in the endless questions that no court verdict could answer. In Argentina, Marina's parents grew old under the weight of grief. Every birthday, every holiday felt like a cruel reminder of the empty chair at the table. Her mother often stared at her daughter's photographs, frozen smiles staring back, and whispered promises that justice would one day come. Maria José's father, once a man of quiet strength, became restless, unable to escape the feeling that the system had stolen not only his daughter, but also the truth. Meanwhile, whispers in Ecuador persisted. In Montañita, strangers who had been there that night began to vanish from memory. Landlords swore they couldn't recall who rented certain rooms. Neighbors claimed their memories were blurred. A convenient fog had settled over the town, making it almost impossible to retrace the girls' final hours. To the families, it felt as though someone had reached into the timeline and erased the evidence with careful precision. Journalists, who dared to question the official version of events, often found themselves silenced. One reporter described receiving late-night calls from an unknown number, a voice warning her to leave Montañita alone. Another, who published an article linking the murders to a suspected drug trafficking route, suddenly resigned and left the country. The coincidences stacked up, too neat to ignore. But still, fragments of alternative stories emerged. A bartender recalled seeing Maria, Jose, and Marina walking near the beach with men he had never seen before, foreigners. tall, confident, and clearly not locals. His testimony never appeared in police records. A taxi driver claimed he was stopped by police when he tried to report seeing the girls being forced into a car. That report vanished as well. The families began to suspect something darker, that the girls had not just been killed, but sacrificed to protect an economy built on tourism and hidden criminal networks. Montañita's paradise image was too profitable to tarnish. Tourists brought money, and the murders of 2 foreign women threatened to unravel everything. Someone, somewhere, had decided that the truth was too costly in Argentina. Activists carried the story forward, ensuring the world did not forget. Marches grew louder, their chants sharper, but the more time passed, the more the truth slipped through their fingers. The mystery became a shadow, stretching longer with every year, until it was almost impossible to tell where the facts ended and where the whispers began. For the families, closure never came. The official verdict was a hollow shell, a story that sounded complete on paper but rang false in the heart. Every time they looked at their daughters' faces, they wondered who else was there that night, who made the decision to silence them, and why was the world so determined to keep those answers buried? The silence weighed heavier than the crime itself. It was not just the murder of 2 women. It was the murder of truth, of trust, of justice. The families carried that silence like chains, and Montañita remained a paradise haunted by ghosts. Some believed the story would fade with time, but for those who knew the girls, for those who loved them, it would never fade. It would echo forever, an unfinished sentence, a shadow in the sunlit streets of a town that refused to speak. The waves of Montañita still crash against the shore with the same hypnotic rhythm. Tourists still dance barefoot on the sand, and music still drifts into the night air. But beneath the paradise lies a silence that refuses to be broken. The story of Maria José Coni and Marina Menegazzo became more than a tragedy, became a symbol of everything hidden beneath the glittering facade of tourist towns, where money flows freely and truth disappears. Years later, the verdict against the 2 men still stands, yet doubts hang in the air like smoke that will not clear. Even now, when locals speak of the case, their voices drop to whispers, eyes shifting as though the truth itself might be listening. Some insist that the real killers were never caught, that the men convicted were pawns sacrificed to protect powerful figures. Others claim the story was twisted to preserve Ecuador's reputation, ensuring that tourists would keep coming. For the families, life split into 2 worlds, the one before Montañita and the one after. Marina's mother once confessed that every night she dreams of her daughter walking through the door, alive, smiling, carrying her backpack as though nothing happened. Maria José's father, hardened by years of unanswered questions, still travels to speak at rallies, his voice shaking but steady, repeating the same demand. We want the truth, not stories, not shadows, the truth. But the truth, it seems, was buried with the girls on that remote Ecuadorian beach. Too many testimonies were silenced, too many files conveniently missing, too many coincidences to dismiss. It was as if someone had carefully built a wall around the crime, letting only fragments slip through. What remains is a patchwork story, stitched together by grief and speculation. A tale that can never be whole. The legacy of Maria José and Marina stretches beyond Montañita. Their faces became banners for women's rights across Latin America, reminders of the dangers women face when traveling, of how easily their stories can be rewritten by those in power. Activists chant their names at protests, their photographs carried through streets lit with candles, their memory burning brighter with every march. Montañita itself never changed. The bars still open at sunset, laughter still rises into the night, and tourists most unaware of what happened still come to escape reality. Yet for those who know, the town feels different. The streets are haunted. The beach holds shadows that sunlight cannot erase. Every corner feels like it carries the echo of two young women who once dreamed of freedom, of adventure, of a world waiting for them. Instead, the world betrayed them. The case became more than a crime, it became a mirror reflecting the way justice bends under pressure, how truth can be suffocated by money, and how the voices of the innocent are often the first to be silenced. Maria José and Marina's story was never just about two women murdered in paradise. It was about a system that chose silence over truth, shadows over clarity. In the end, there is no neat ending, no final chapter that brings closure. The girls' families are left with questions that no court can answer, with wounds that time cannot heal. Their story lingers like the tide rising, falling, always returning. And so, in Montañita, when the night grows too quiet and the sea too loud, some say you can still feel their presence. Two travelers whose journey ended too soon, their voices carried in the wind, their laughter remembered in silence. They are not gone, not really. They remain in every whisper for justice, in every candle lit, in every unanswered question. They are echoes that never fade.